Good morning and good afternoon, distinguished and honorable participants. Thank you for connecting from the world for today's event. I welcome you all to the African Development Bank's hybrid seminar on the African Economic Outlook 2023 for Asian audiences. This year's event will be co-organized and partnered with the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, called the KIEP-KIEP. Many participants are now flooding into the event at the same time. I can see the increasing number of participants. So please allow us to wait for 2 more minutes to start the actual event. While participants are joining us now, I would like to announce the procedure for participating in today's event. The session will be in a hybrid format, a physical gathering at the KIEP headquarters in Sejong City, Korea, and online participation. Today's webinar is scheduled to last 2 hours, including the time for Q&A session. All attendees will be muted when joining the event to ensure audio quality. And the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen is active, so please feel free to leave your questions during the hybrid seminar, and the AFDB's economists and panelists will try to respond to your questions as they come, or during the Q&A session toward the end of the event. The chat function is inactive, and then the whole session is being recorded now, and then it will be shared on the AFDB's official YouTube and Vimeo accounts later for those who came late or missed some key points. Please note that African Economic Outlook highlights in Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans are now posted on the AFDB Asia language website. Also, you can download the full report and highlights in English, French, Portuguese, and Arabic from the AFDB website, www.afdb.org. So please download them. The seminar will be mainly held in English, and simultaneous interpretation in French will also be available on the ground on Zoom and YouTube live stream. For the Zoom participants, please look at the language function at the bottom of your screen and choose your language of preference. All right, so without further ado, let me now officially open today's event. So a warm welcome to all of you who have taken the time to join us today to listen to the presentation and discussion of the 2023 African Economic Outlook for Asian audiences by our eminent panelists. The African Economic Outlook is the AFDB's flagship report, serving as a valuable tool for economic intelligence, policy dialogue, and operational effectiveness. My name is Yuna Che. I'm the External Relations and Communication Officer of the African Development Bank. It is my great honor that I will lead today's hybrid seminar together with the panelists and colleagues. The African Development Bank is a dynamic institution in a fast-changing continent. The AFDB currently has 81 member countries in the world. There are about 40 offices across the African continent, and the bank's Asia External Representation Office is the only external representation office outside of Africa. The bank's Asia office was established 11 years ago to strengthen the partnership between the AFDB's Asian member countries and the African continent. We have supported Asia's public and private sector to help them do more business and facilitate more cooperation with African countries through the AFDB. There are 4 Asian member countries of the African Development Bank as of today, namely China, India, Japan, and Korea. So this year's presentation will be the fourth edition to be organized after successful sessions co-organized by the African Development Bank's Asia Office, the Macroeconomic Policy, Forecasting and Research Department since 2020. And this year's event will be jointly co-organized with the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, KIEP, to present the African Economic Outlook 2023 report to Asian markets. The KIEP is a national policy research institute established to conduct studies, research, and analysis of global economic issues, guiding the nation toward effective international economic policies. KIEP has a team of experts dedicated to do in-depth research on the emerging economies in Africa under the Center of introduce and welcome the first speaker, Ambassador Edmond Wega, Executive Director for Korea, Canada, China, Kuwait, and Turkey at the African Development Bank, will present opening remarks. Ambassador Wega has more than 20 years of experience in international development and relations. Ambassador Wega held several leadership positions at Global Affairs Canada, including Director General for International Assistance Operation Bureau, Acting Director for the Eastern and Southern Africa region, and Senior Director for Pan-African Programming. At the Canadian International Development Agency, Ambassador Wega led the Canada Fund for Africa Secretariat, delivering on Canada's $500 million committed to the NEPAD, and also served as Acting Director of Management Services for Europe, Middle East, and Maghreb. In Canadian diplomatic missions and overseas, Ambassador Wega served as Canada's ambassador to Burkina Faso and Benin, but also as Canada's head of development cooperation for countries including Mozambique, Malawi, and Ethiopia. It is our great honor to have you, Ambassador Wega, in Korea. So let's welcome Executive Director Ambassador Wega. The floor is yours.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor and a pleasure for me to be here today on this very special event, the presentation of the African Economic Outlook 2023, which will be done by my brother, Kevin Orama, Vice President and Senior Economist. As we think about the African Economic Outlook, it's difficult to not think about what's happening in the world because Africa does not exist in isolation from the world. And then when we look at what's happening in the world, when we look at the media, what we hear about is the situation in Ukraine. We hear about crisis here and there. We hear about climate change and climatic shocks everywhere. We hear about conflicts. We hear about post-COVID. If we were to give this presentation 5 years ago, I'm sure the content would have been a bit different. So what do we take from all of that? The reality is that we can live in a way which allows us to be comfortable in our own environment, or we can embrace what the world has to offer. And as we think about Africa today, as we think about the continent today, there's one word that comes to mind, and it's power. Power not in a repressive way. Power not in a way to suppress the rights of others. Power not in a way to control, but power in a way to impact. Power in a way to transcend some of the challenges that we have. Power in a way to really go from success to significance. And as we think about that today, that power can be linked to a number of key points. One, vision. the power of having a vision that goes beyond what we hear about every single day, but that embraces the future. A vision that sees what others don't see already. But the power of commitment to act on that vision, commitment to do something about the environment in which we work, to support those who are the poorest and the most vulnerable, but also power to act in a way which brings others together rather than separating people, which unites rather than divides, but also the power of partnerships. We live in a world where we have to embrace those who are different. We have to embrace those who think differently, because unless we work with them, we will be isolating ourselves. So we have to embrace new ways of doing things, innovation, and all of that. And the last power that I would talk about is the power of knowledge. And that allows me to connect it to the African economic outlook. Yes, we can focus on the Africa which has to do with conflicts, with COVID, with crisis, with challenges. It is true, but it's only a tiny part of the reality of Africa. The risk that we have associated to Africa is more than what the reality is. So we can also look into the power of that knowledge that comes from having information like this one. The knowledge that will allow us to make the right decisions at the right time for the right reasons. The power to change the world. Because changing the world doesn't happen in an instant. It starts with small actions that actually have an impact on a few people, on a number of people, and on a group. That creates a movement that will help people really go beyond what they would have done. So we can shy away from Africa, or we can look beyond the challenges and see the opportunities. There is a say that in every crisis, in every situation, there are multiple opportunities. And I hope that's the spirit we use to embrace the continent. To embrace the continent in a way which allows the Asian continent to put at work its expertise, its experience, its resources, its technology to have what I consider win-win relationships. Working with countries, working with the African Development Bank, working with institutions in a way which allows to get to that point of convergence of interests, where things become real and where people are changed. Change doesn't happen in an instant. It happens in our ability to change our minds first. And I really do hope that the Asian continent, that those who are listening today will embrace that. Because that's power. Power in a way which brings the best in people. Power in a way which really helps develop the human cause. In a way which allows countries to go from a situation of desperation to one of hope and of joy and of peace. So I thank you for the time you will be having here, and I wish you a very fruitful deliberation. And I leave you with that thought, that in every single crisis lies multiple opportunities. And I hope Asia will embrace that. As executive director representing Korea and representing China at the African Development Bank Board of Directors, I'm very proud to be here, to learn, to listen, so I can lead. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Executive Director Ambassador Vega, for your insightful and encouraging remarks. Your powerful and knowledgeable remarks touched our hearts beyond the report findings itself. Now, I would like to welcome Dr. Songchun Jung to deliver his welcoming remarks. Dr. Songchun Jung is the Senior Vice President of the Africa Institute for International Economic Policy, KIEP. He has published numerous academic articles and policy research papers on the economic policy by the Japanese government and its implication for Korea. His major research areas are international macroeconomics, environmental economics, and Japanese economy. Dr. Jung has also conducted the research on international negotiations on climate change and other global environmental issues. So thank you very much for your warm welcoming and hosting us today at the KIEP's beautiful campus in Sejong City, Korea. Senior Vice President Dr. Jung, the floor is yours now.
Your Excellency, Professor Kevin Chika-Urama, Vice President of AFDB, and Your Excellency Ambassador Edmund Vega, Executive Director of AFDB, and distinguished speakers and guests, and dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and good morning to all of you. My name is Songchun Jung, Senior Vice President of KIEP. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this seminar on the African Economic Outlook 2023, jointly organized by the African Development Bank. On behalf of KIEP, I appreciate this opportunity to host the seminar here at the Institute, which aims to discuss the current issues on African economic growth and challenges and opportunities of cooperation between Africa and Asia for sustainable growth. We are here today to share insightful thoughts on the global economy in an age of uncertainty. The recent crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's invasion to Ukraine have shed light on vulnerability of global supply chains, reshaping the global environment for trade and investment. Despite a sign of gradual recovery, the global economic growth remains still very low, and financial risks have risen. The economic headwinds are hindering Africa's development, really. The most pressing challenge is high inflation from rising food and energy prices. Inflation is more than double pre-pandemic levels, worsening food insecurity and increasing social unrest events in the continent, African continent. Furthermore, the tightening of global financial conditions has limited government's flexibility to increase resources for economic recovery. In addition, profound shifts are on the way as part of green transition. Although Africa is the world's smallest contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions, it pays a disproportionately high price in terms of social and economic consequences from climate change and environmental degradation. Most of the African countries have committed to ambitious targets for climate resilient development, while green growth is top of the agenda. Addressing climate change is costly. And the climate finance in Africa falls short of what is needed to meet the climate objectives. We all understand that addressing climate change provides opportunities to create future drivers of economic growth. Africa has potential as a future frontier market in green growth opportunities, with its fastest growing population and abundant renewable energy and mineral resources. Therefore, African countries' efforts to tackle climate change need to be strongly supported by international community through financing, technological transfer, and capacity building. Particularly, the private sector must play a more prominent role in closing the climate finance gap in Africa. So, mobilizing investment in African climate solutions will require innovation in financing structure to overcome the existing market barriers, improve capital efficiency, and strategically deploy public capital to crowd in private investment. In this regard, cooperation between Asian and African countries is more important than ever for implementing the sustainable transition and building climate resilience in Africa. Korea is at the forefront of green growth initiatives and playing a leading role in global climate actions. The Korean government collaborates with international organizations to promote low carbon development trajectories and green transition in developing countries. The African Development Bank has shown a strong commitment in supporting the regional member countries, RMCs, in their pursuing a more inclusive and sustainable development. The bank links national financial institutions with the international financial system so that it provides the most crucial source of long-term and reliable finance. Today's event will contribute in a valuable way to discussing how to promote prosperity and stability by strengthening cooperation between Africa and Asia. I hope that this seminar marks a forward step to accelerate exchange of knowledge between KIEP and AFDB, and the two institutes will continue to establish an excellent network of economists and help promote significant research in the field of international economics. Once again, I warmly welcome the speakers and thanks all of you for being present, especially the participants online in distant time zones. I look forward to the presentation and constructive discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your kind remarks and informative suggestions, Senior Vice President Dr. Song Chun-jung. Once again, we are grateful for co-hosting this meaningful annual event with KIEP in 2023. Before I move to the next session, there is one announcement that the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen is active in the Zoom. So please feel free to leave your questions during this hybrid seminar, and then there will be a Q&A session, so we will take some from them, and also the AFDB's economist and panelists will try to respond to your questions as they come. All right, so now I would like to welcome Professor Kevin Chika-Urama to deliver his presentation on the 2023 African Economic Outlook. Professor Kevin Chika-Urama is currently the Chief Economist and Vice President for Economic Governance and Knowledge Management at the African Development Bank Group. Vice President Professor Urama is an elected fellow of the African Academy of Sciences, a distinguished professor of the University of Nigeria, an extraordinary professor in the School of Public Leadership, Stellenbosch University, South Africa. Also, he is an adjunct professor at the Sir Walter Murdoch School of Public Policy and International Affairs, Western Australia, a member of the Global Council on the UN Sustainable Development Goals (SDG) for the term 2021 to 2023. Prior to joining the African Development Bank, Vice President Kevin Urama was the inaugural Managing Director of the Quantum Global Research Lab in Switzerland, and also he was the Executive Director of the African Technology Policy Studies Network and Senior Research Fellow at the Macaulay Land Use Research Institute, Scotland. So please warm welcome the Vice President, Professor Urama. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yuna. Dr. Sung Chung Jung, Vice President for CAPE, colleagues, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, those in the room and those connected virtually. No worries. So to share with you facts about Africa's macroeconomic performance and outlook in the short and the medium term, and then also to share with you in this particular stage where the global financial architecture is actually being unfolding and is being discussed with regard to the reforms that are required and the calls for increased participation of the private sector financing in addressing all the goals that we all care about, the sustainable development goals, but also national and regional goals, including poverty alleviation. So the title for the Economic Outlook Report for 2023 from the African Development Bank Group is on mobilizing private sector financing for climate and green growth in Africa. So in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to talk you through 3 major chapters of the report, key findings, and hopefully you will be able to read the reports, which is available on our website. We'll have a few copies here for you to collect as well. The first chapter of the report looks at Africa's economic performance and outlook. The second chapter looks at private sector financing for climate and green growth in Africa, while the third chapter looks at a key sector on the continent that actually could be a driver for financing of climate and green growth transitions on the continent, that is natural capital of the continent. As we all know, the continent is richly endowed with natural capital that can actually help drive green transitions, not only in Africa, but in the rest of the world. Then we try to draw some recommendations for policymakers at different levels, national governments, regional governments, the Pan-African continent, but also what development finance institutions, multilateral development banks, as well as development partners like South Korea could do to help leverage the opportunities that exist within Africa in this particular sector we're talking about. So chapter 1 of the report. First, if you look at this particular slide, on the left side of the slide, you look at the real GDP growth of the continent between the years 2019 and 2024. As we all know, this was the period when the world has faced complex challenges, from COVID-19 to deepening losses and damages because of climate change, but also the spillover effects of Russia's war in Ukraine. What you can see from there is what we characterize in the report as a show of marked resilience by the African continent in regards that it keeps bouncing back despite the huge shocks that we have. So there on the red line, you can see that Africa is next to Asia with regard to the recovery in the real GDP growth, now growing at 3.8%, higher than the average growth globally, but also projected to be growing at 4.1% in the years 2023 and 2024. So these growth rates that we see is not only good because Africa is recovering in terms of percentage growth rates, but when you look at the underlying structures of the economies, you see that good governance, macroeconomic stability is increasing in many parts of the continent. And I will come back to that. One weakness that we identify is that private sector consumption and investment and industrial sector growth remain weak on the continent, and hence the topic of the AEO report for this year focusing on that key aspect of mobilizing private sector financing. And again, for people and investors looking at African continent, often discuss the continent as a country. So here we want to we delved deeper into the different regional dimensions that we see with regard to the growth story we talk about, because Africa is not one country. It is a heterogeneous continent with 54 independent sovereign states, different levels of economic growth, different systems that is operating in terms of governance structures, and also the differences in the investment risks and risk opportunities that exist in those regions. So if you look at that map on the left side of the slide, you can find different the fact that all the regions of the continent have rebounded and is actually resilient with regard to its economic growth trajectories. But you find that Southern Africa was hardest hit with regard to the COVID impacts, seeing a contraction in GDP up to 6%, but now back on track, still growing at a lower rate than all the other regions because of structural challenges like energy shortages that we find we still have grappling with in the largest economy in that region, being South Africa. But you see regions like Central Africa and Eastern Africa that has a very positive story. Eastern Africa was the only region that actually escaped recession during the COVID-19 pandemic. And when you look at why this is happening, you find it's because of diversification of the economies and also good macroeconomic policies that's being implemented across that region. Central Africa is also very interesting, benefiting a lot from the commodity price rebound that occurred during this period post-COVID-19. But if you look at all the other regions, Africa maintains a very positive and resilient growth trajectory. On the right side of the graph there, you can see disaggregating these growth trajectories by the different structures of the economy, of economies of countries, whether they are resource intensive or non-resource intensive, tourism dependent, or low middle income countries within the continent. And again, you see heterogeneity with regard to the impacts of these confounding shocks, which the president of the African Development Bank calls the triple Cs, the COVID, the conflicts, and the climate. And you find that one key takeaway from that analysis is that countries that are more integrated with the global economy felt greater shocks, greater impacts from the global shocks that we had. So that, because of that, you find that there was a big rebound in the tourism-dependent economies in the year 2021 because of accumulated savings in tourism-source countries. But as the war in Ukraine stepped in and those, the resurgence of tourism went down, their economy also went down very significantly. So that's one key takeaway that we see. Even though we have resilient growth in Africa, the growth in several African countries are actually not very stable over time. It keeps going up and down, tracking developments in the global economy. This is something that needs to be watched. Now, but we have several other structural issues and challenges that we are watching on the continent. As already mentioned by the Vice President for Kiev, sustained tightening of global financial conditions has put pressure on Africa's national currencies. So you see exchange rate challenges within several African countries, seeing depreciations in their local currencies, domestic currencies, significantly. You can see up to 220-something% there in Libya. And several countries that have suffered significant depreciations because of the strengthening of the dollar and also the pass-through effects of Russia's war in Ukraine and several other factors you will find in the report. And the other side of this challenge is consumer price inflation. And we have seen consumer price inflation rise to the highest level since the pre-pandemic period, and actually like double what we had pre-pandemic period. But the good news is, when you look at the heterogeneity on the continent, there was a balance in terms of that inflationary impacts on the continent, because some countries also had benefits from these challenges. And when you net it out, the impact on the continent is not really very significant so much. And we project that in 2023 and 2024, by 2024, the inflationary rates will go down to single digits and actually below the pre-pandemic level. Now, the other challenge that we are closely watching on the continent is debt vulnerabilities that has worsened because of the rapid exchange rates, depreciation, and high primary deficits in several countries. On the right, on the left side of that map, on that red line, you can find that resource-intensive countries, again, are the ones that are having higher impact with regards to the debt stock, the growth in the debt stock. But three things I want to mention regarding the debt dynamics on the continent. One is being driven a lot by external factors. If you look at the right side of that slide, which is a decomposition of the drivers of public debt on the continent, you'll find that exchange rate depreciation is a major challenge that is creating the debt on the continent. But again, the rise, the strengthening of the dollar, the repayment rates for debt and other things, all these things are so interconnected with other global policies. So like E.D. Weger was saying in his opening remarks, we're now living in a world that is so interconnected that managing economies requires understanding policies and cooperation with other economies as well, because the markets are so integrated as it were now. But the other point there is that the structure of debt on the continent has changed significantly. Even though we've seen the rising, a significant rise up to $1 trillion in the total debt stock on the continent, the most worrying part is that the composition of debt has changed significantly away from the Paris Club lenders and more towards the commercial debt that is quite often short-term, more opaque, and high cost. And that is creating significant challenges for countries with regard to managing the fiscal squeeze that countries have because of responding to climate change impacts, which is a global good, and also responding to COVID-19, which was a global commons challenge that we all need to work together to address. So what's my point here? The challenges that exist in African countries today are challenges that are actually mostly external. And responses to those challenges also should be international. So international cooperation with regard to addressing debt dynamics on the continent, with also regard to addressing the climate change impacts on the continent, and also building capacity to continue strengthening the economic governance capacity of countries and the strength and regulatory capacity in institutions remain a global commons opportunity, not a challenge, that we all need to work together in order to address. So the tightening global financial conditions I've talked about has increased debt service costs. So the best way to put it for me in a very simple term is that countries, if you are a country in Africa that has not borrowed anything since 2021, your debt sustainability debt vulnerability has increased, not because you're borrowing, but because of the changes in the global policies and the fiscal conditions, tightening of fiscal conditions in different countries around the world. So we need to think about that as we go forward. With this snapshot, what are the key risks to watch on the continent as an investor, as a global partner, as a partner to Africa, and also as African countries? One, subdued growth around the world remain a big challenge because of that interconnection. So especially subdued growth in export destinations for many of Africa's commodities. The other one is a high rates of interest and debt service costs, which I've talked about, so I don't need to explain it further, but also commodity dependence and price volatility in the commodity markets remain a major challenge on the continent. If you try to track, especially for resource-intensive countries on the continent, GDP growth trails the price of major commodities that they export to the global market. And when you look at that price of major commodities and look at the real revenue that comes from that, the real price of those commodities, you also find that it's been declining over time. So and also very volatile, making it very difficult for countries to plan for the medium to the longer term. And then finally, the fiscal risks of climate change, which has continued to now deepen the fiscal risks of countries, as countries will have to use scarce resources to adapt to challenges that they did not create, as has already been raised by the Senior Vice President. But more importantly, rebuilding infrastructure that is washed away by climate change and climate change impacts. So the discussions around loss and damage and the common but differentiated responsibility for climate adaptation and mitigation remain a central point that we need to all continue to work towards. How can the private sector come in? And then we'll find here in this chapter, the second chapter of the report, that green growth imperatives for poverty reduction and climate change economics and economic resilience in Africa are very closely interrelated. Africa is a continent where pursuing green growth policies is actually helping. It has actually huge potentials to help build economies and also address the climate change challenges. Again, what this means is that countries like Korea that has high levels of technologies and knowledge on green growth. This was a country that started the Global Green Growth Institute when countries and around the world didn't yet see green growth as a major priority. Africa is the place to actually apply those knowledge, the technologies, and also investments in order to drive green growth, to drive the global common good of achieving green growth transition, of achieving climate transitions and climate resilience, but also helping significantly in doing good to humanity by alleviating poverty and allowing Africa to grow its economies structurally. So that correlation is what we try to depict in this slide. So summarily here is that pursuing green growth objectives in Africa yields immense economic and climate benefits, not even just co-benefits, but direct benefits that you can track and measure. But despite that, when we look at the green growth, that's what I call green growth or green development paradox in Africa. That paradox is that we all know that Africa has huge resources. Africa is now about a $3 trillion economy and growing. $3 trillion market, growing. Human capital, up to 1.4 billion people, projected to reach around 2.4 by 2050. Over 40% of that are youths under 25. huge innovative youths and women population waiting to be harnessed for industrialization and growth. We have significant natural resource endowments in several sectors. For renewable energy transitions, for example, 44.8% of global renewable energy technical potential are in Africa. So how transitions to renewable energy development globally happens, Africa is like 50% of that. Africa holds 65% of uncultivated arable land in the world. So how the future of climate-smart agriculture evolves and food security in the world over time evolves depends also on how that 65% of land is utilized. Africa is a continent that has huge potentials in all the green minerals you can talk about, cobalt, lithium, and all these things. Huge percentages of that are concentrated in Africa. So these are huge opportunities for investments, but also huge opportunities to drive the global green growth agenda, which is helping to develop those resources so that Africa can grow its economies, improve social security and reduce social fragility, but also deliver on our global common good. Green technology potential I have mentioned, but we also have low legacy in high emissions infrastructure. So asset stranding risks in green transitions is lowest in Africa because it's like virgin land. So it's a lot easier to develop these technologies and support Africa to grow green and go green and deliver on the climate goals of the world without really having too much of retrofitting expense and asset stranding risks. And we also see high and growing political commitment of the African leaders on the subject of green transitions. Many African countries are signed on to the Paris Agreement and are very keen on developing and working on their long-term transitions to green economy and so on, realizing that there's huge benefits for economic growth there. But those potentials can only be achieved if the global community also meets the commitments that are required with regard to addressing the nationally determined contributions in terms of the common but differentiated responsibilities that was agreed in Paris. But because that is not yet being achieved, the financing is not coming in, and countries are struggling with economic growth objectives, climate objectives, and other social fragilities addressing insecurity and other things, then we are seeing that the continent that has all these potentials that we've talked about are performing poorly with regard to the green growth benchmarks that we have. All the green growth indicators, Africa is actually second to Middle East in terms of, and South Asia with regard to achieving its green growth objectives. So if you look at all the green growth indicators, the continent is still performing very poorly. And again, you would have expected that given these huge potentials, the private sector would be looking over Africa everywhere where to invest and do good by delivering public goods and also do well by harnessing those resources and both human, social, and natural capital that I have talked about. But that is not happening. We see, if you just take climate change, you see that total climate finance in Africa is still too small, both public and private sources, compared to what is required for Africa to achieve the NDCs. We are currently at around $29.5 billion US dollars. And the total climate finance from the private sector is even much more minuscule. We have just about 4.2 billion coming from the private sector. And if you take the totality of these, about 75% of those are debt instruments, deepening debt vulnerabilities for countries that are facing climate vulnerabilities. This is not the objective of the climate finance agenda that was supposed to help countries with mitigation and adaptation and reduce vulnerabilities to climate change. What we find in our report is that countries that are the higher your vulnerability to climate change, the less likelihood of you receiving climate finance. And if you look at proportions of climate finance that has gone to countries, you can find Africa there very small, about 14% of the global. So the flow of climate change, of climate finance, just like the flow of global financing for development, is inversely related to the needs for development, in this case, climate vulnerability and climate readiness. That needs to be reversed. Africa needs about $2.7 trillion cumulatively. That is between 2020 and 2030 to implement the nationally determined contributions. Those who remember COP21 in Paris, there was this NDCs that was prepared and agreed as part of the Paris Agreement on condition that there is conditional NDCs and unconditional NDCs. About 20% of that in Africa was unconditional, that domestic financing should meet, but about 80% should come from financing from the global community, and that is not happening. So we need 242.4 billion each year, and we're receiving less than 30. So the huge gap simply means that the NDCs will not be achieved in Africa, no matter what the African countries tries to do. And if the NDCs are not achieved in Africa, the NDCs globally will not be achieved. Africa is 17% of the world, and Africa is the pool where all these opportunities exist. So private sector financing that is also coming are the kinds of instruments that are being used, and the sectors that are also being focused on is also biased towards mitigation, especially energy systems. Over 70-something%, about 74% of total climate finance is going into renewable energy technologies. And then that leaves a huge gap on the areas where Africa really needs financing, which is in adaptation, and so on and so forth. So that's mitigation bias is also another thing that we need to think about. But there are huge opportunities across the continent for investments to do good and do well. Make money, and I repeat, make money, because the returns on investment in Africa is about the highest in the world. And the risks, perceived risk, as E.D. Wega mentioned, is perceived to be high, making the cost of capital very high, and then reducing access to capital markets for African countries. But when you look at research, which I'm going to come to, the evidence actually shows that Africa's default rate is lowest than everywhere in the world. Look at agriculture, estimated to be about $1 trillion market by 2030. Energy, $1.03 trillion by 2030. ICT, growing at $104.2 billion annually, and this is expected to continue to grow exponentially. Transport, also growing at 22% annually with regard to electric vehicles, and this is also expected to continue to increase as the green transition technologies continues to take root. Again, Korea has huge opportunities here, because Korea is a country that has really, distinguished itself with regard to technologies and innovations in several areas. And agriculture, all these sectors that mentioned here are huge sectors of opportunities for international trade for Korea. And then Africa is not leveraging this expansion that is provided in terms of all these innovative financing that we're talking about. On climate, green bonds, about $2.2 trillion market globally. Africa is only receiving 4.7, participating with regard to only 4.7 billion, which is 0.2% of the total. Even the global voluntary carbon markets were still at 6.2%, which is $123 million. And considering the fact that Africa has the second largest forests for carbon sequestration in the world, those things are just not matching what should be done. The place where Africa has been doing a bit better is with regard to blended finance. 41% of that between 2019 and 2021, but the total global blended finance is actually not that much. So what are the key enablers? How can we make this to happen? And this was very interesting for me in the research because we were thinking that you are going to get environmental factors as reasons for how to enable these climate or environmental policies to drive the climate transitions, the green transitions on the continent. But guess what? It was not most of that. Gross national income per capita was a major driver. So those countries that have higher incomes on the continent had greater aptitude to mobilize climate finance. And also public climate finance per capita, which means the amount of resources that the public sector in these countries are able to put forward also helps to leverage the private sector. So if we don't address some of those intrinsic macroeconomic and poverty reduction agendas, we can also not achieve the green growth trajectories that we have been talking about. But we have several barriers that African countries need to work on. Lack of strategies and implementation effectiveness is one of them. Weak regulatory structures and institutions is another. Limited investments, investment-ready projects and pipelines is another. Limited access to international markets. I'm rushing these because these are standard things that we hear about Africa. And limited experience of global public investors and bilateral partners. This one is very key for institutions like yours, because private sector, the global private sector have very limited experience on the continent. They rely on perceived risks, and those perceptions is built on information asymmetry. One thing happens in one country in Africa, and we generalize about the continent, forgetting all the huge opportunities in other sovereign states. And because of this, we have high levels of perceived investment risks on the continent, driving poor credit ratings on the continent. And because of these poor credit ratings, Africa is losing a lot of access to the capital markets because of the high cost of capital that you find. But if you try to understand that risk, what Edie, my executive director, was saying flies in your face, because what we see as perceived risk is totally different from what you see as the actual risks on the ground. So, for example, Moody's Analytics did a study, several years of studies, and found out that default rates on infrastructure, long-term infrastructure, and project financing is lowest in Africa than in most parts of the world, at 1.9%, compared to like 12.4% in East Europe, and several other things. So we see, again, a paradox. A continent that has lowest default rates has poor and sometimes subjective credit ratings in international markets. And what that does is that just increases the cost of capital and reduces access to global finance, whether it's climate or other infrastructure financing opportunities. A study by UNDP shows us that if only the global rating agencies used an equitable and fair methodology, Africa will be saving about $74.5 billion US. That's on the private sector. How far we are going, where we are not harnessing the opportunities, what we need to do in order to be able to harness the opportunities more. And things are there, but it's not being actually harnessed as it's supposed to be harnessed. Africa's measured natural capital was valued in 2018 at $6.2 trillion US. So, and that's distributed across different regions. Because we recognize the heterogeneity in regions and countries in Africa, we will be releasing this month regional economic outlook reports for each of the 5 regions in Africa, repeating this kind of analysis. But also in August, we're releasing country-focused reports to provide you with factual evidence for each country on the continent. There are ample opportunities for Africa to harness, to leverage resources from the international agreements we have, like the global carbon market and other things. I'm not going to go into that in detail. But for the sake of research and international trade and investment, let me just mention 2 huge opportunities, or maybe 3. One is the Great Green Wall Accelerator Program, which has raised more than 19 billion US dollars, a program that is being championed by the African Development Bank and partners from several countries in the Sahel region, from Mauritania to Senegal, Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Eritrea, and so on, and Nigeria, and also Burkina Faso. Huge opportunities for investments in production of renewable energy, but also reforestation and climate-smart agriculture, making money and providing global public goods. Then also the opportunities for green hydrogen is everywhere on the continent, if you look at that map there. And so it is for gas to power and other transition technologies that we need to move forward. And then electric vehicles. So far, you find that Africa is only playing at the lower levels of the value chain, mining, which is worth about 11 billion US dollars. But if you go forward, the market is up to 7 trillion US dollars, much more if we get into electric vehicles and so on. Korea has huge technological opportunities and advantage in these areas as well. And one underpinning study here is a study that's been done with UNECA, and we find that establishing a precursor factory in DR Congo for electric vehicle, for lithium-ion batteries is like 3 times cheaper than doing that in China. And the reasons are obvious. The transport of raw materials from source and then return of those raw materials. And this also comes with carbon footprint. If we are able to cut out all those shippings, we reduce the carbon footprint of products. So it's good for the environment, it's good for creating jobs and growing the economies of these poor countries, reducing social fragilities and migration, but also delivering on the global goods that we want. But what are the key barriers of leveraging this market that we've talked about? Resource governance and weak capacity, regulatory structures is a major challenge on the continent, but also illicit flows of resources, which is financing and resources, which is actually bleeding the continent of over 90 billion US dollars annually. So policies and research and technical advice on how to block these will be a very useful thing that your institute, for example, can do. But political instability and resource conflicts is also a major challenge. And one area we're working strongly on now at the African Development Bank, and I actually want to call on you to work together with us on it, is natural capital accounting and how we can rebase Africa's GDP, taking into account the positive externalities of the natural resources that we have. That's an ongoing work that I'm calling on us to work together with. Let me just rush through the policy recommendations because of time. One, at the national level, addressing inflation is very clear, standard recommendation, anti-inflationary monetary policy. But in doing this, we need to make sure that we have fiscal policy measures that actually helps to address the impacts on the most vulnerable parts of the population. Coordinated debt treatment and focusing a lot more on debt productivity and so on is a major challenge, a major thing that we need to do, and developing long-term strategies and also adopting accelerating the implementation of the Africa payment systems is also another thing. There are several things that we need to do there, deepening the domestic capital markets and boosting domestic revenue mobilization. The slides are with you, so I'm not going to go through that in much detail. Multilateral Development Bank and development finance institutions. Now that we're discussing reforms of the MDBs, reform of the global finance institutions, we need to think of what really needs to be done to address these misalignments that we've talked about. One, multilateral development banks need to expand concessional financing and grants for capacity building, much more than that will allow countries to address some of the structural issues that we have discussed there. But they need to revisit also the risk appetite, because this risk perception drives capital away from the places we need it as a global community to address climate change, to address biodiversity loss, and all those things that we're talking about. But using innovative financing mechanisms continue to remain important, but aligning operations also with the Bridgetown Initiative And providing more risk-agnostic catalytic capital is another major thing that we need to continue to work on. But generally, we need to start moving away from project-by-project interventions and financing to a more system-wide financing model that builds sustainability and growth together. The private sector is just exercise market leadership and stewardship. We need to drive the growth in this area as much as we can because, again, first movers in markets, green transitions is the future. So moving fast into areas where the raw materials are will also be a huge smart objective to do. But credit rating agencies could also review their methodologies to broaden the rating frameworks to address this information asymmetry. Again, here, research and knowledge and data becomes very, very relevant. And working with you on improving the availability of data on African markets will also be very useful to help even the credit rating agencies. But developed countries just honor the community. Establish national development plans and green transitions that are clear and credible and implementable. This is for national member countries in Africa to do. But again, as a research institute, helping countries with doing that, drawing on lessons and experiences from Korea and other Asian countries will be a very positive thing. Incentivizing green industries in order to spur growth on the continent is also very crucial. And then as a research institute, helping with research on what incentives work and has worked elsewhere, sharing experiences would be a great thing that this institute could do with the African Development Bank and other institutes in Africa. But banks need to provide, MDBs need to provide much more credit guarantees, risk guarantee instruments to help de-risk the environment, but also work on macroeconomic policy management is another way of actually systemically de-risking the market environment. And this is an area you can also help with. But countries also need to develop pipelines of bankable projects and that has high risk adjusted rates of returns. And again, think of ways of asset recycling where we can offload some of those risks by through several types of innovative financing mechanisms that the bank is already working on to the private sector. I think with this, I would like to bring it to a close, and thank you again for having us here. Thanks to the colleagues who are watching online. We'll be ready to take questions and participate in the discussions going forward. Sorry for running over the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Professor Kevin Rama, for this insightful presentation. I hope all our participants now have a good prediction and outlook about this year's economic situation in Africa. And Vice President, we would like to listen to you more in the discussion session. There will be also Q&A session at the end of the seminar. So please feel free to leave your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And we will also take some questions from the floor on the ground in Korea. We already received several questions in June, and Dr. Anthony Simpasa, manager, and Dr. Hamed Al-Musa, chief research economist of the African Development Bank, who prepared and read the African Economic Outlook report, already responded. So please feel free to read them in the Q&A box. And now it is a discussion time. So we are honored to have three distinguished discussants from China, Japan, and Korea on the panel. Also, this session, as well as the Q&A session, will be moderated by Dr. Moon-Soo Kang, head of Africa and Middle East team for Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, KIA. Just to briefly introduce about Dr. Moon-Soo Kang is an agricultural economist. His research interests extend to agricultural production, climate change, land institution, and household labor in African countries. His recent research includes impacts of climate change and policy implications on food security in Africa and the Middle East, research on green energy cooperation with East Africa, and food security threats and policy responses in EU and Africa, and so on. So Dr. Kang, let me pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much. As I got introduced, my name is Moon-Soo Kang from Kiev. I'm the head of the Africa and Middle East team. From now on, we will move on to discussion session. And as Yuna explained, we have 3 discussion panels. So first of all, let me introduce Dr. Song-Bae Ahn. He's the director of the International Macroeconomics and Finance Department at KIEP. So for the discussion session, each discussant have 7 minutes to discuss, and then we will have a Q&A session. So Dr. Ahn, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. My name is Song-Bae Ahn, and thank you for dear Professor Rama for interesting presentation. So my discussion on his presentation will be focused on the chapter 1 part. So basically the outlook, the forecast, and well, the KIEP is basically publishes the World Economic Outlook biannually. So one in May and one in November. So I will talk about a little bit about what I found during the last several years job on the forecasting. So this is our recent publication. So May, last May. So on the left side, you see that our projection on the world economic growth. So our 23, we projected at 2.6, and 24 and 3.0. So it is a little bit downgraded from last year's growth, and while keeping up a little bit back on track next year. So well, there's some other reasons for numbers. So one is so interesting number here is that the U.S. growth rate, which is projected to slow down over time. And another one is that China's case, because China last year has been a little bit limited by the quarantine policy, strict quarantine policy. So this year's growth is somehow projected to high at 5.5%, but next year will be a little bit slowed down. So this is something we have, as I said, we have a biannual publication. So there's the 3 graphs, 3 bars that on the 2023 growth projection from different point of time. So the first gray one is the last 2022 May, and then green, the sky blue is the November 22 numbers, and the last one is the last May's number. So as you can see that across most of the region, somehow the growth projection has been slowed down for 2023, and it'll be picking up after that. So this is the same for, the projection has the same kind of the dynamics over time from other institutions too. So on the left, this is the 2023 world the growth projections from different institutions like the IMF and OECD. And what you can see here is that at the end of the 22 and in all the 23, the growth has been the growth projection was there was a downward revision before during the 22, and then after that there is a slight upward revision after that. So one of the main reason there is that basically this year we are expecting that due to the China's reopening, so the projection the growth will be a little bit better than expected compared to last year. So there's we have some keyword on for each publication. We will present the keyword of the current economic situation and a little bit of list of the key risks. So the recent publication, our keyword to the current world economy, global economy, is the narrow path to a slow recovery. So that means that basically there is some path to the recovery, which is very slow. But this path is very narrow. So maybe there's something happens, then somehow recovery may not be attained. So some of the downside risk that we are focusing on right now is that the financial instability and the credit contraction. This is the main things that everybody will agree on that. And the other one is that weakening of global policy coordination, because there's some there's the stakeholders in the global economy has a little bit different view on how the world should work. And the third one is the China's debt distress problem. So this is kind of the history that the series of the keywords and the risk factors that we have looked at for the last 2 years. So just look at the keyword on the title part. So from the May 2020 to November 22. So it's that, May 2020, so we said the keyword is COVID-19 pandemic. So as you expect, that there's a big shock there. And then after that, November 22, we said that prevention and rehabilitation of the global economies was important. And May 21, we said that there's an uneven recovery and some kind of the differentiated policy means that at that point, we expect that the advanced economies and the developing economy will have some different laid in the different situation, so that policy situation is different. And November 21, we said, we emphasized the great transformation, which covers the digital transformation and the green transformation. And actually, at the end of the 21, in the policy, the global policy landscape, there's a big blue. There's some rosy view that economy there will be some faster recovery due to the government the government-driven the big policies and the huge investment on this digital transformation and green transformation. But the reality does not really, like what works in that way. So in May 22, we said, that there is a hyper uncertainty in the recovering path, which means that, related to the war, the Ukraine, the Russian-Ukraine war. And last year, at the end of last year, we said suppressed recovery amid tightening and fragmentation. And now, we are saying that narrow path to a slow recovery. So somehow, for the last couple of years, there's so many big shocks that hits the economy, global economy, which has an impact on, say, Korea and also Africa in general, right? So, and there's some big hope at one point, the great transformation time. But, after that, that was not, still somehow the implementation is still delayed in some sense, right? So, in the report, our report, we have also some African sections. We have some sub-Saharan Africa the projections, and here, as you can see, 2023, our projection on the sub-Saharan African is a little bit, the downward revision, like from 3.9 from last May, 2022 May, and 3.7 and 3.5 annual growth for 2023. And here, in the section, we also talk about some key issues in the sub-Saharan area, so region. They are one of the issues, so I just, so here, 22 May, we are thinking about some inflation pressure in the sub-Saharan region was quite important, because it's coming from the food and commodity price hikes and supply chain disruption, and foreign exchange rate pressures and political instability, so which is kind of combined with in line with Dr. Urama's the presentation. And here, last November, we are also looking at some FDI into that region, where we thought about there's an increasing FDI to that region, and this is the due to the increased demand on natural gas and renewable energy. So somehow, this is related to somehow this green growth things, and I think it is kind of what happening from last year, and it will be somehow related to what has been presented in the previous presentation. And when the risk the recent publication, we talked about, say, the debt distress in the region. So somehow, there are there are a little bit of complicated stakeholders in the debt, national debt in South African countries, or somehow there's some international effort is needed to solve that issue. So that is somehow our view on this the things, right? So some basic policy implication. You can see that briefly. Speed of liquidity contraction has been slowed, but concern still remains. And negative effects of maybe permanent changes in global value chain. And third one is the room for stabilization policy is very limited, so need for focus on structural changes. So in more detail, to help the reallocation of the resources from unproductive to productive units and support newly growing industries and combining new technologies into traditional ones, and enhance IT and green tech-driven investment for sustainable long-term growth. So that is somehow what is needed, not only in Africa, but also in the global economy in general. That's my discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. An. Thank you for the valuable discussion about the economic growth prospects of South Korea and the global society. So next, we will invite Mr. Koji Mitomori. Let me introduce Ms. Hong Miao. She is from China, and she is the program director and senior energy expert and development director at the World Resource Institute China. So she will have a discussion for 7 minutes. So Hong Miao, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be here. And I'm Hong Miao from WI China office, and I'm director of a sustainable investment program. And also I'm responsible for implementing the Green Chinese Overseas Investment Project, which started from 3 years ago. So actually the project priority areas of the renewable energy developments in Africa and Southeast Asia. So I would like to share our data and evidence-based researches, analysis, and some findings on renewable energy investments in Africa. Sorry. Hello?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, I can. First of all, I would like to say the consensus comes out gradually that significant increase in solar and wind power capacity needs to happen in regions such as Africa. And actually even by 2026, to achieve the global temperature control target of 1.5 degrees centigrade. And I would like to say some data actually we reviewed. I think according to say the IEA estimates, the installed capacity of solar and wind by 2026 in Africa should be 2.3 times of those in 2020. So compared to 1.5 times globally and 1.9 times in Southeast Asia regions. So that's a great, potential as the estimate globally, and also main syntax. And also according to IEA Africa Energy Outlook 2022, by now there are, say, 300 million people. This around 43 of total African population without electricity supply, and most of them live in sub-Saharan Africa. And also for those of the area, most of this region, renewable energy resources is abundant. And so it's a really great opportunity and potential actually for renewable energy for this region. And also from a synergy impact perspective, like we would like to say, the renewable energy development, no doubt, will contribute to economic growth in a green pathway, and also diversification while promoting sustainable development and addressing the continent's energy needs. I think that's a huge, say, potential. And although there are great opportunity, like we would like to say, for renewable energy financing in Africa, especially solar potential in area that don't have access to electricity. According to IRENA Renewable Energy Market Analysis 2022, in the past 2 decades, only 2% of global renewable energy investment went to Africa. So that's really the big issue. Well, it's also observed through COFI, the database WI project developed and maintained, and the green overseas investment projects. COFI referring to, say, China overseas finance inventory. That's a database. We use this database to track the progress of a Chinese overseas investment on power sector, since the objective of the project is to shift the Chinese overseas investment from fossil fuel to renewable energy. So the right chart of this slice, we can say is a quite, not encouraged. Only, say, 3.5% of Chinese debt investment on power sector went to renewable energy, say, in Africa region. So that's also our we observed. And however, while Chinese investors and financiers accumulated, more and more experiences in renewable energy development and financing over the years, mainly in China, in domestic market, growing interest from Chinese enterprises, I would like to emphasize, including the SOE and the POEs, in expanding their overseas renewable energy investment and business is clearly observed. And as one of our partners, a survey and interview of more than 100 enterprises, in China, from energy investment group, power sector design institutes, solar wind industry and supply chain, the result represents that 80% of the, say, interviewee are planning to increase their overseas renewable energy business. So that's a really, I mean, great findings. And also 20% plans to invest in renewable energy manufacturer industry. And of course, I would like to say this 10% is not really high because of the, I mean, the participants of the interview and the survey are really diversified. Some of them are from the, say, the investment sector, some of them are from industry sectors. So, but we can say 80% is generally, say, the stakeholders in China. So they are planning to increase their overseas renewable energy business. So that's quite encouraged. Why, say, the big potential market is there, investor interest is there, and the investment is not really happened. Why? Why is that? So I think the hesitation comes from the risk perception. So we did some specific analysis and knowledge sharing products on that. So from the project different stage, as this slides show, the risks refer to some points or some stages. I mean, first of all, at the early stage, the project identity opportunity, I mean, is quite huge, but the project preparation is complex and costly. I have to say that. I mean, according to WIS, I mean, analysis projects, I mean, quite costly and risky. And also it will typically contribute 5 to 10% of the total cost of an infrastructure projects in developing countries. It takes, say, specialized capability to conduct conception analysis and feasibility analysis. What's more, the project may still fail to reach tender or financial close, meaning this cost can turn out to be for nothing. So without sufficient funding, project preparation become a missing link. So it's really, say, the issue, and also hampering many projects from getting off the ground. So that's really the big issue. And say the secondly, I would say, I mean, less finance products, like Kevin just mentioned. So it's available from a finance sector. I mean, less on guarantee, less on enhancement mechanism. So that's also the, say, the risk, I mean, for the investment. The third one is, say, the potential unproductive use of renewable energy is not really matured or explored adequately. So it's a really great potential there, but the business model is not available, and so the financing model is not really matured yet. And the last one, I mean, is quite clear, say the insufficient local capacity from planning, from a manufacturing industry, as well as operation and maintenance of renewable energy projects development and operation is really the, I mean, the risk. I mean, so that's all the risk or the hesitation from a Chinese investors' point of view. So it's great for this webinar with the topic of private sector financing for climate and green growth in Africa. It's obviously that MDB could play more and more roles to address the challenge, but it's not enough. And it needs to explore new ways for private mobilization. As a WI analysis in 2021, say for every dollar of climate finance MDB provided, they mobilized only 25 cents in private finance. So it's even less than the last year, say 26 cents. So how to involve in private investors in financing renewable energy in Africa? So I think the project team are trying to make efforts to pilot, say through trilateral collaboration. I mean, so that's what we are, say, doing some efforts actually to just cooperate with more developed country to develop and finance renewable energy in Africa. So that's the one type of the efforts. And also we are doing, say, the work to take advantage of, say, cooperating with aid from China. And since what we are focusing is a people-centralized energy and economic development and the transition in Africa. So that's the same and align with Chinese government's, initiative or the strategy. So it's a good. And also the last one, like the PPP model, especially under circumstance of that issue in Africa, we are cooperating with a local partner to improve renewable energy investment from government policy, regulation framework, institutional framework, and also the capacity and market readiness. So I think we would like to, since we are just a start to piloting these efforts, we would like to share the progress and maybe lessons learned, and also hopefully the experience with shareholders who are interested in renewable energy investment and financing in Africa. So that's what I want to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hong Miao. You discussed about how Asian countries and Africa can cooperate in terms of the energy sector. So our last discussant is from Japan. He's Mr. Koji Mitomori. He's the director and of the Office for Climate Change Global Environment Department at JICA. So Mr. Mitomori, you have 7 minutes for the discussion. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon and good morning. Thank you very much for having me this great seminar and FD colleagues and KRP colleagues. My name is Mitomori Koji, as introduced from JICA. And as you know, JICA is the bilateral cooperation agency extend technical cooperation and the investment, ODA loan, or including a private sector investment, and also grant aid. So from point of view, bilateral cooperation agency, today I want to share what we are doing on climate change, especially in the African region. So, okay. And firstly, we have climate change policy. It is called the Global Agenda. And in this global agenda, we try to invite various stakeholders like private sector or academics or other stakeholders to achieve this common goals of our JICA global agenda. And we have two approaches. One is the promotion of the implementation of Paris Agreement, and we put the numerical indicators like increase of the number of trained people, 10,000 people. And the other approach too is the co-benefit of climate change. Pursue both development benefit and also climate benefit. And we put the target of the climate finance 1 trillion yen per year. It means about $8 billion US. And as you know, developed countries have common goal to achieve 100 billion USD per year for climate finance. And the JICA have sort of ambitious target as to the climate finance to contribute a huge part. At the same time, we believe that especially for African regions, adaptation is very important. So we try to double the contribution for climate change for adaptation contribution to double by 2030. So, and let me explain slightly further for approach one, Paris Agreement implementation. And since the climate change target year is 2030 or 2050, the time is not abundant. So we need to start very soon. And at the same time, a lot of our partner countries, means developing countries, need the capacity development to implement the Paris Agreement. So we support the development and the implementation of plans like formulating, implementing and monitoring a climate change plan like a NDC or long-term strategy preparation or implementation. And also transparency framework is very important since they, like a lot of countries want to issue the a carbon credit, but at the same time quality is very important. So like a GHG inventories and the also requirement to the Paris Agreement. Biannual transparency report support is the one of the target, and and also we put focus on the Green Climate Fund since JICA is accredited entity of GCF. And the like headquarters Incheon in Korea, and we are trying to support through the GCF project. And the most of currently we have a lot of the experience. The picture shown here is the Vietnam case, and the in Asian countries. And the other is the co-benefit climate change. And the co-benefit of climate change is the we define as written here. Due to the time constraints, I only explained. We want to try to maximize synergies, both development and climate change measures, and also minimize the potential trade-offs. That is the core part of our co-benefit of the climate change. And based on that, we implement a co-benefit of climate change, both mitigation and adaptation. As to the mitigation, we focus on energy sector, urban development, transportation, and traffic. And of course, conservation of forest and natural environment. That is very important in the African continent. And as to adaptation, we have a lot of experience disaster risk management since Japan experienced or a lot of natural disasters, and we have plenty of knowledge. And the water resource management and agriculture is we have a lot in the focused areas. And as to the case of the Africa, we focus on 3 points: low carbon, climate resilient urban development, assessment of climate risk, early warning system, and forest and nature conservation. So let me explain some examples. First, low carbon climate resilient urban development. This is the case of the Kenya Olkaria geothermal power plant. Through our loan project, worth 29.5 billion Japanese yen, developed a geothermal power plant in Kenya. And at the same time, we combined the capacity development through our technical cooperation to assist them to improve the technical level of exploration or drilling of the partner country, Kenya. And at the same time, through our loan project, we invite the private sector like a Hitachi Power System, Mitsubishi Power Industry for this implementation of project. And not only this scheme phase, we have another several schemes for this geothermal power plant in Kenya. And next, assessment of climate risk. This is the case of the tackling the climate risks. This project is just signed in Tanzania Agriculture Input Support Project, and the 10 billion Japanese yen. This project is a co-finance with the AFDB under the ACFA for tackling food security crisis. And this project responds to the food security crisis influenced by the climate change or other international situation. And we provide high quality agriculture inputs such as seed and fertilizers. So those financial support, we support tackling the climate risks. And as to the forestry and nature conservation, we have a lot of technical cooperation projects, especially Congo Basin area or COMIFAC country. We provide that contribution to promotion of conservation of sustainable management of forest. And at the same time, we try to support for lead plus preparation and also utilize the satellite. JICA and JAXA is the aerospace agency of Japan, launched the forest monitoring and the showing the satellite map. And the red dot is the newly deforested area. It's shown here. So I'm rushing, but we currently have the 215 projects all over the world, and the 64 projects goes to Africa. So of course, Asia and the Africa is the one of the biggest our focused areas. So that's all for my explanation. To hope to catch the idea of the JICA's cooperation on climate change in Africa. So back to the chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We got some idea about how JICA is cooperating in terms of the climate change with African countries. So we just have several minutes, but I want to open the floor because there are many participants in the on-site and in the online as well. So from the on-site participants, if you have any questions, please raise your hand and I will get 2 questions from the on-site participants. And also from the online participants, I got several questions, but we selected just 2, and then I will ask Dr. Urama directly. So if you have any question, please raise your hand. Or I will go through the online question first. So as everyone knows, Africa is in the green transition path, and do you think the green growth agenda to alleviate poverty and increasing the global competitiveness can be achieved together? So this is the first question. And the second question is about the foreign direct investment, FDI. So there are many FDIs going on in African countries. So first one is resource-seeking FDI, and second one is market-seeking FDI. So under the situation, what is the way forward for the FDI, and how does the AFCFTA's protocol on investment capture this? So we have to. So what is the way forward of the FDI in Africa, and how does the AFCFTA's protocol on investment capture this FDI situation?
Yeah, thank you very much. First, let me thank the discussants for very exciting contributions on renewable energy from China, and also from JICA on several interventions that is being implemented across the continent. JICA is a very renowned long-term partner to Africa in several of these transitions and in financing development on the continent. So thank you very much. On the question of achieving poverty alleviation and green growth transitions concurrently, that was the very reason the first slide we had shared on chapter 2 of the report focused on that question. Because for quite a long time, there's been quite this idea that there is a high level of trade-offs between poverty alleviation, economic development, and environmental policy. I think based on the data we see on the continent, that's actually a misnomer, because there's quite a very strong correlation between addressing climate change opportunities, green growth transition opportunities, and alleviating poverty on the continent. but depends on how we think of the climate change and green growth opportunities. Because in our view, like these green minerals that Africa has, the opportunities for Africa is not to export minerals, the raw commodities, and then bring back the processed commodities. Like I explained, that is bad for the economy because the real value, the real price of commodities in the global market keeps going down if you deflate that on inflation. So the more you export raw commodities is basically the poorer you get. So that's one. And then the other thing is that now you export these raw commodities, quite often heavy, because they're unprocessed. They have to be shipped to places in distant lands for production into factories, and that carries with it carbon emissions. And so there's huge carbon emissions going to where you produce, might be China, US, or everywhere, anywhere, and then you ship it back again to the large markets we have in Africa and across the world. So the carbon footprint of the project, the embedded carbon in the products, the final products, becomes very high. So that addressing that in terms of in the manufacturing sector. So for us, addressing the green transition would then mean that countries create policies I normally call franchising policies or local content policies, whatever you want to choose to call it, but that allows for value addition in the green minerals that we have. And that will help create jobs, that will help alleviate poverty, that will help create wealth in the countries, but also that will help cut the carbon emissions in the logistics chain. But also that's good for the investor because, again, you are nearer to the raw materials, so you cut out that cost of logistics, but also you create your corporate social responsibility very easily, and the cost of trying to protect investments from risks of vandalization and is just gone. So it's a win-win-win for both the investor, the private investor, for climate and sustainable development agenda, but also for the countries that own those resources. So that is one. Then the other side of it also, if you think about why poverty alleviation becomes good, is that if you look at a lot of the emissions on the continent, when I was working on climate change reports for the IPCC, you find that a lot of the emissions from Africa comes from the AFOLU sector, the agriculture, forestry, and land use sector. And this is because of poor technologies, poor agricultural practices. Everything is basically the marginal output of economic benefits has huge carbon emissions. And you find that in transport, you find that in buildings, you find that everywhere. If you drive on a car in many African cities, maybe the cars are already 20, 30, 40 years old. So for every mileage you cover, you are emitting high levels of CO2, and you are burning more fuel, which is cash. It's your money that you are burning off there. So it's not good for CO2 emissions. It's not good for the wealth of the driver, the owners of the vehicles, and it's also not good for health because the CO2 emissions and carbon monoxide and everything will actually create problems. If you address infrastructure in Africa, again, you increase the efficiency. So let's think about the technical efficiency of producing economic goods and services. If you think about it from that angle, then you find that the best way to decouple environmental pollution and environmental impacts on the from economic activity is actually by growing economies. So that two objectives are actually mutually reinforcing instead of the trade-offs that we have always considered it to be. FDIs in Africa. The trends we see is that FDI is going down, ODA is going down, concessional financing is going down, and that is what is constraining countries to go into costly and unsustainable debt. So our perspective is that going down of all these financing and ODA and so on is not a good strategy because it actually leads to more systemic fiscal challenges on the continent, and that needs to be turned around. Excuse me.
Thank you very much. This might be our last question of this session, and then I will give the mic to Yuna. How stronger collaboration and business ties between Africa and Asia would help the sustainable development in Africa?
Can you repeat?
So how stronger collaboration and business ties between Africa and Asia would help the sustainable development in Africa?
Yeah, again, thank you very much. That's a very good question. Stronger collaboration between Asia and Africa will help sustainable development goals in Africa strongly for several reasons. One is shared prosperity. Africa remains the treasure trove of the world, and for me, smart investors invest in Africa. So first thing is to call for Asian investors, Asian governments to actually see Africa as not that distant land of opportunities, but a land of shared prosperity, that we can actually invest, do good by doing well. Then the other thing that I need to mention there is shared history. The African, I mean, if I think of South Korea, where we are now, the history of South Korea in terms of economic development is very similar to many economies on the continent. So we have a lot to learn from South Korea, and South Korea has a lot to learn from Africa. And the same for China, for India, for many of the Asian countries. There are significant similarities in our economic development histories that we can learn from. Culturally and everything, you find a lot more similarities within Asia and Africa than elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Urama. Actually, we have already prepared some questions for the discussant, but because of the time limit, I will give all discussant one question each, but the answer you can do it in 1 minute, please. Thank you. To Dr. Song-Bae Ahn, the question is that as the global financial situation tightens and the Russia-Ukraine war continues, inflation in Africa has become a serious and critical problem affecting the economy and people's life. If we go further, what kind of tools do you think could help African countries to reduce the inflation problem in the long-term perspectives? This is the first question for Dr. Ahn. And my second question to Mr. Mitomori is that, as you know, sustainable development, strong, sustained economic growth, and climate action are critical for Africa. And it is important to concurrently achieve those priorities, and we need the commitment for the green growth pathways. How do you think development partners such as JICA can support Africa's climate and green? And what kind of policy and market barriers exist in Africa to achieve the green growth pathways? And this is my real last question, and this goes to Ms. Hong Miao. Do you think Africa can escape from the vicious cycle stemming from the excessive dependence on the natural resource as an export and primary products? And how do you think Africa can create more value in the continent, strengthening productive capabilities and expanding exports and intra-African trade through the AFCFTA or through partnership with Asia? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think, first of all, about say the Africa can escape from the various circle. I mean, stemming from the excessive depends on the exports of natural resource or primary products. I think it's a good question, actually, of the Africa's ability to do so. I mean, we can say is really over-reliance on fossil fuel and unpressed exports currently in the continent. I mean, according to our analysis, I mean, now is a significant portion, I think over 60% of the merchandise exports in 45 out of 55 African countries consists of unprocessed commodities such as crude oil, natural gas, mineral, and agricultural raw materials. So these commodities contribute substantial to government revenue in Africa countries. And also, I think it's quite risky. I mean, this heavy depends on unprocessed commodity as per, I mean, really expose African economics to price volatility in the global market. And it's really stopped another way, say a robust, sustainable, and inclusive industry development, which would say really disuse the wide benefits to society and the economy. And also, I think for this situation is the quite clear the current rather rapid global shift towards renewable energy and clean energy will lead to the considerable decrease in the demands of importing, say, fossil fuel, making rely on fossil fuel, say, as per a short-term and risk strategy. I think to avoid being trapped in this vulnerable position, Africa could really seize the opportunity presented by the global shifting towards the green, say, transition and also green energy and rapid decarbonization. Renewable energy is really the good opportunity and also the option. As all we know, we discussed, say, Africa, say, possesses several advantages that can be leveraged for the economic transformation and energy development. With the world's, fastest growing and the youngest population, Africa is poised for the industry progress and the increased energy demands. Rather than considering the shift to renewable energy as a threat to traditional experts, it should be seen as an opportunity to enhance and expand the energy infrastructure to address existing gaps and meet future needs. I think it's quite clear. And also there are so many opportunities and also the merging and new way of the economic development, say synergy with green and also low carbon, like the energy supply, energy production, so in Africa. So that's really the, opportunity for that. I think, for the second, how really, say, Africa and Asia can cooperate to strengthen the, cooperation on trade through the Africa Continental Mechanism, or we call it it's the African Continental Free Trade Area. So I think it's quite clear from China, at least, the government already has a very ambitious and very positive pledge, and it's announced at 2021 UN General Assembly that it would stop, say, to build new coal power plants, and also it will increase support for green and low carbon, say, development in developing countries. So that's a Chinese pledge. I think also China also had, say, announced Global Development Initiative. It's really the China's, governments and also the investors are, say, ready, or they are willing to do more on the green and the low carbon development investment and more project development in Africa. So I think that's the way. And also for the local, we just interviewed and talked to the Chinese businessmen, say how really do the business in Africa. They also mentioned some issues in their mind, especially like the how really improve the readiness for the foreign, say, businessmen to do the business in Africa. I think so. It's a really, good opportunity, I think, to lead to creation of value-added products and diversification of economics and great integration into regional and global value chain So that's Africa can play more and important role in this, say, the global, windows, global development momentum, I think. And also, say, as I just mentioned, with China, say, Chinese investors and enterprises, they would like to, through the international cooperation, say, to work with other like OECD countries to invest and also to involve in the Africa economic development, especially in this green and low carbon, say, pathway. I think so. The unlock private investor is really important. So I think the MDB, they play the role, and meanwhile more innovative finance products and also innovative way to just allow more private to involve. So that's a really need to the efforts from both Africa and also the Asian investors and stakeholders work together. So
Thank you very much.
I may just stop here.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, we can go to Mr. Mitomori.
Thank you very much for the question. And as to your question, what JICA can do for green growth in Africa, and I think we have two things: both financial support and the technical support for green growth in Africa. And as to the financial support, as I explained, we can support for the like a food crisis or other things. But at the same time, we have private sector investment, and we just started our facility for accelerating climate change resilient sustainability society, we call Access, about $1.5 billion US targeting. So and that is both mitigation and adaptation. And at the same time, from Asia, Africa is geographically slightly far, so more and more private introduction. So we have the startup enterprise scheme to encourage startups. So that is that not only the direct investment, at the same time the startups investment is also very important. That and at the same time JICA support the technical cooperation and to develop development plan, green growth development plan, like master plan preparation for partner countries. So and I think a lot of countries already prepare NDCs, but they don't have, very few have the long-term strategy up to 2050. So that part, I believe JICA can have the room for support for like a strategic implementation of green growth for African countries. So thank you very much. Back to Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mitomori. Lastly, we will have Dr. An.
Okay, so if the inflation go into the medium term, then, well, I think this is a big policy change challenges, not only the African country, but also to Korea. So one thing is that, well, the current inflation is kind of the exogenous, right? So coming from, say, well, from the war or say, the cost push kind of nature is there. So, but in reality, I think is that as a result, the interest rate keeps going on, and so that makes the people difficult to borrow money from other part. And there, one thing is that, well, given the situation that that distress problem is in Africa, and also, well, in Korea, well, the household debt problem is also there. So somehow, I would expect that, well, in the near future, somehow, this is kind of the end of the era of the free fund, well, with the low interest rate for the time being. So somehow, but the most important part of our daily life is that actually the real growth of the economy rather than inflation itself. So, and in the high inflation, I mean, when I look back, there was 70s in Korea. There was a very high inflation period there, but we had some high growth period also there. And there, for that, somehow. Given the scarcity of the fund, somehow efficient allocation of the resources are really important. So I think that every policymaker should think about how to use this given the resources more efficiently to promote the growth at the end of the day. So that's my answer.
Thank you very much. We still have many things to talk and discuss, but because of the time limit, I want to finish this discussion session. Thank you for all discussion from Japan, China, and Korea, and also Professor Urama as well. I will give the mic to Yuna. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kang, for your brilliant moderation. Thank you also all very much, all the panelists, for this fruitful session. I also would like to thank our participants who asked the pertinent questions. Before closing the event, I wanted to share some important information with you all. The whole session was recorded and then it will be shared on the AFDB's official YouTube and Vimeo account later. And also please note that the African Economic Outlook highlights in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean are posted on the AFDB's Asian language website now. Also, you can download the full report and highlights in English, French, Portuguese, and Arabic from the African Development Bank website. So please download them. And also the talking points by Vice President Professor Kevin Urama on the African Economic Outlook 2023 into Korean, Japanese, and Chinese will be posted on the Asian language website in a few weeks. Last but not least, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to the simultaneous interpreters from Korea and Kiev Africa team, Dr. Kang and Dr. Han, the AFDB's ECMR department, Anthony, Betty, Hamed, Francis, Amadou, and Asia office team, Nao, Min, Jiyoung, Mayumi, and Niashi, and IT and communication colleagues, Dorsaf, Gaurav, Raquel, Romaric for making this event so successful. Once again, thank you for all speakers and all Asian, African, and worldwide participants for your active participation. We really look forward to seeing you all at the next year's event. Please stay safe. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. 谢谢. 아리가또 고자이마스. 나마스테. 감사합니다.
Thank you. 谢谢。ありがとうございました。감사합니다.
Thank you very much.